The blood was pooling beneath me as I collapsed in my own living room, my 73-year-old body finally giving out after a massive stroke. My daughter Carol was screaming for an ambulance, but I knew I was dying, and there was something I had to confess before I took my last breath. I grabbed her arm with what little strength I had left and whispered the words that would destroy not just her life, but the lives of 47 families. Carol, I have to tell you something horrible. For 30 years as a labor nurse, I switched babies. I switched 47 babies at birth and sent them home with the wrong families. None of those children know who their real parents are. The shock on my daughter's face was nothing compared to the horror that was about to unfold when she realized that she herself might be one of those switched babies. Before I continue my story, I really want to know where you're watching me from. Tell me in the comments what city you're from, and if you can, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. My name is Margaret O'Sullivan, and I'm dying on the hardwood floor of my house in Boston, Massachusetts. 47 minutes ago, my daughter Carol still believed I was the dedicated nurse who had delivered hundreds of babies during my career at St. Mary's Hospital. She thought I was the caring professional who had helped bring life into the world, who had comforted new mothers and celebrated every birth like it was a miracle. But the truth is, I'm a monster who systematically destroyed 47 families by switching their newborn babies for my own twisted reasons. It started in 1975 when I was 25 years old and working as a labor and delivery nurse at St. Mary's Hospital in downtown Boston. I had been trying to get pregnant with my husband Patrick for 3 years, suffering through multiple miscarriages and failed fertility treatments. Every day, I watched other women give birth effortlessly to healthy babies while I went home empty-handed, my arms aching to hold a child of my own. The obsession with having a baby was consuming my life. Patrick and I had spent our entire savings on fertility doctors, experimental treatments, and adoption applications that went nowhere. I was becoming bitter, jealous, and increasingly unhinged every time I had to help deliver someone else's healthy baby. That's when I started making my first terrible decision. Mrs. Jennifer Walsh came into the hospital on a rainy Tuesday night in November 1975, 9 months pregnant and completely alone. She was 17 years old, unmarried, and her family had disowned her for getting pregnant. She had no support system, no money, and she'd already decided to give the baby up for adoption through a Catholic agency. When she gave birth to a perfect, healthy baby girl with bright blue eyes and blonde hair, I held that beautiful child and felt something snap inside my brain. This teenage girl didn't want her baby. She was going to give her away anyway. Meanwhile, I was dying inside every day, desperate for a child I couldn't have. So I made a decision that would haunt me for the next 48 years. In the nursery that night, there was another baby girl born just 2 hours earlier to Maria Santos, a woman who already had 4 children at home and had mentioned during labor that she wasn't sure how she'd manage another mouth to feed. Her baby had dark hair and brown eyes, but she was small and sickly, born with a heart murmur that would require expensive medical care. I switched them. I took Jennifer Walsh's healthy blonde baby and gave her to Maria Santos, who was so exhausted from the delivery that she barely looked at the child before falling asleep. Then I took Maria's sickly, dark-haired baby and placed her in Jennifer's arms when she woke up. Jennifer Walsh signed the adoption papers the next morning, giving away a baby that wasn't even hers. Maria Santos took home a healthy blonde child, never knowing she'd left her biological daughter behind, and that sickly baby with the heart murmur. She went into the adoption system and was placed with a family who could afford the medical care she needed. The switch was so easy, so seamless, that no one suspected anything. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had some control over the cruel randomness of who gets to be happy and who doesn't. That was my first switch, but it wouldn't be my last. Over the next 30 years, I developed a twisted system for redistributing babies based on my own warped sense of justice. Rich families who seemed ungrateful for their blessings would find themselves taking home babies born to poor, struggling mothers. Teenage girls who didn't want their babies would unknowingly give away children born to loving families who desperately wanted them. Single mothers who seemed overwhelmed would go home with babies born to stable two-parent households. I told myself I was playing God in a good way, making sure babies ended up with families who would love and provide for them properly. But the truth was, I was living out my own revenge fantasy against a world that had denied me the child I wanted. The process became almost routine, and I developed an elaborate system for selecting my targets and covering my tracks. I worked the night shift, when there were fewer staff members around and more chaos in the maternity ward. I would spend weeks observing expectant mothers during their prenatal visits, listening to their conversations, evaluating their circumstances, and deciding who deserved which babies based on my twisted moral compass. I created detailed mental profiles of each family. The Martinellis had been trying to have a baby for 8 years and had spent their life savings on fertility treatments. The Johnsons already had 4 children and complained constantly about money problems. Mrs. Chen was a successful surgeon but made racist comments about other patients. Rosa Martinez was a teenage mother whose boyfriend had abandoned her, but she worked 2 jobs and was taking night classes to become a nurse herself. In my warped mind, I was conducting a grand social experiment, redistributing babies to create better outcomes for everyone involved. I told myself I was a guardian angel, correcting the cruel randomness of genetics and circumstances. The hospital's record-keeping in the 1970s and 1980s made my deception relatively easy. Everything was handwritten charts and paper wristbands that could easily be switched or corrected if there was confusion. I became an expert at creating just enough chaos and misdirection to cover my tracks. My method was always the same. I would wait for nights when multiple babies were born within a few hours of each other. During the busy transition periods, when babies were being moved between the nursery and the mother's rooms for feeding, I would switch the identification bracelets and alter the handwritten charts. If anyone questioned a discrepancy, I would claim there had been clerical errors during the hectic delivery period and volunteer to fix the paperwork myself. The few times other nurses noticed that a baby looked different from what they remembered, I would point out how much newborns change in their first few days, or suggest that exhaustion was affecting their memory. Most people didn't want to admit they might be wrong about something so important, so they would accept my explanations and move on. But I wasn't just randomly switching babies based on momentary impulses. I was methodical, calculating, and absolutely ruthless in my decision-making process. I kept detailed mental notes about each family's circumstances, and I planned my switches weeks in advance. But I wasn't just randomly switching babies. I was methodical, calculating, and absolutely ruthless in my decision-making. The Hendersons were a wealthy couple from Beacon Hill who came in for the birth of their 3rd child in 1978. During her labor, Mrs. Henderson complained constantly about the hospital accommodations, demanded special treatment, and made disparaging comments about the kind of people who used public hospitals. When she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, I decided she didn't deserve him. That same night, Rosa Martinez, a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her elderly parents, gave birth to her first child after years of trying. She was so grateful for everything, thanking every nurse, crying with joy when she held her son, promising to give him the best life she could, despite having very little money. I switched their babies. Mrs. Henderson took home Rosa's biological son and raised him in luxury on Beacon Hill, never knowing he wasn't genetically hers. Rosa Martinez took home the Henderson baby and worked herself to the bone to provide for a child who wasn't biologically hers, but who she loved with every fiber of her being. Both families were happy with their children, never suspecting the switch. But I knew, and that knowledge gave me a sick sense of satisfaction that I was correcting the universe's mistakes. What I didn't anticipate was how addictive this power would become, or how the psychological burden of maintaining these secrets would slowly drive me insane. Each switch created a new layer of lies I had to remember and maintain. I started keeping a secret journal at home, documenting every detail of the switches, not just for my own records, but because I was becoming obsessed with tracking the outcomes of my social experiments. I would drive by the houses of switched families on my days off, watching the children play in their yards, evaluating whether I had made the right decisions. I became a stalker of my own victims, unable to let go of the lives I had manipulated. The Kowalski twins were born in March 1979 to parents who already had 6 children and were clearly overwhelmed by the prospect of twins. That same night, the Brennans, who had been trying to conceive for 12 years, suffered what they believed was their 7th miscarriage. Mrs. Brennan was sedated and devastated, while Mr. Brennan sat in the waiting room sobbing. I saw an opportunity to give the Brennans the miracle they desperately wanted while relieving the Kowalskis of a burden they couldn't handle. I switched one of the Kowalski twins with a stillborn baby from another delivery that night, then placed the living twin in the Brennans' room, telling them that one baby had survived against all odds. The Kowalskis were told that one of their twins had died from complications, while the other was healthy and strong. The Brennans raised their miracle baby with incredible love and devotion, giving him every advantage in life. The surviving Kowalski twin grew up in a chaotic household with limited resources, but surrounded by siblings who adored him. Both children thrived in their own ways, but the Kowalski parents spent 20 years grieving a son who was actually alive and being raised just across town. That switch haunted me more than the others because it involved creating false grief and false joy simultaneously. I had made the Kowalskis mourn a living child while giving the Brennans a miracle that wasn't really theirs. But the power to control life and death, happiness and sorrow, was too intoxicating for me to stop. If this story is shocking you, hit that subscribe button because what I did over the next 27 years was even more twisted and systematic. By 1985, I had switched 23 babies and developed an elaborate mental catalog of which children had gone to which families. I kept detailed notes hidden in my home office, tracking the switched children as they grew up, sometimes even driving by their houses to see how they were doing in their redistributed lives. The psychological toll of maintaining this secret was enormous, but I was also addicted to the power it gave me. I was the only person who knew the truth about these families, the only one who could see the results of my social engineering experiment. Some of the switches worked out exactly as I'd hoped. The babies I placed with loving, financially stable families thrived and excelled. Children I'd taken away from teenage mothers or overwhelmed families grew up with advantages they never would have had otherwise. But other switches created devastating consequences that I tried not to think about. In 1982, I switched baby Daniel Murphy, born to alcoholic parents who already had 3 children in foster care, with baby Christopher Liu, born to a loving couple who had tried for years to have children. I thought I was saving Daniel from a life of neglect and giving the Lius the child they desperately wanted. Christopher Liu grew up with the Murphy family, who were so dysfunctional that he ended up in juvenile detention by age 14 and struggled with addiction throughout his 20s. Meanwhile, Daniel Murphy grew up as Daniel Liu with parents who adored him and gave him every opportunity in life. From a statistical standpoint, my switch had worked. One child got a better life. But Christopher Liu's suffering was a direct result of my decision to play God with their lives. The weight of these consequences started eating away at me, but I couldn't stop. The power to control destiny was too intoxicating, and I'd gone too far to turn back. By the mid-1980s, I was switching babies almost monthly, and the psychological strain was beginning to show. I developed insomnia, paranoia, and an obsessive need to control every aspect of the maternity ward. Other nurses started commenting on my strange behavior, how I would hover around certain families, ask too many personal questions about their circumstances, and volunteer for extra shifts whenever there were multiple births scheduled. I became convinced that other staff members were suspicious of me, so I started being even more careful and methodical in my planning. I began studying the hospital's shift schedules, memorizing which nurses worked which days, and timing my switches for maximum chaos and minimum oversight. The irony was that my growing paranoia actually made me better at concealing my crimes. I developed backup plans for every switch, alternative explanations for any discrepancies, and an almost supernatural ability to redirect suspicion away from myself. Dr. Patricia Morris, the head of obstetrics, called me into her office in 1986 after several nurses reported that I was acting strangely around newborns. "Margaret, is everything all right at home?" she asked with genuine concern. "Some of the staff have mentioned that you seem unusually invested in our patients' personal lives." I convinced her that I was just passionate about helping families during difficult times and that my interest in their circumstances came from a desire to provide better emotional support. Dr. Morris accepted my explanation and even praised me for my dedication to patient care. That conversation should have been a wake-up call, but instead it reinforced my belief that I was smarter than everyone around me and that my mission was too important to abandon. The most complicated case came in 1987 when I made a switch that would eventually lead to my own daughter discovering the truth. Catherine Williams was 19 years old, unmarried, and terrified when she came to deliver her baby. Her boyfriend had abandoned her when she got pregnant. Her parents had kicked her out of the house, and she was planning to give the baby up for adoption. When she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl with red hair and green eyes, I saw an opportunity. That same night, Eleanor and Robert Chen, a successful doctor and lawyer couple, gave birth to their first child after years of fertility treatments. Their baby girl was healthy, but had some minor physical characteristics that disappointed them. They'd made comments during the pregnancy about hoping for a child who would fit in their social circles. I switched the babies. Catherine Williams signed adoption papers the next day, giving away a baby that wasn't biologically hers. The Chen baby went into the adoption system and was placed with a wonderful family in Vermont. And Eleanor and Robert Chen took home Catherine's red-haired daughter, never knowing she wasn't genetically theirs. That red-haired baby was my daughter Carol. The woman I raised, who was sitting beside me as I died, wasn't biologically mine. She was the daughter of a 19-year-old girl who thought she'd given her child up for adoption, and the biological daughter of the Chen couple who took home the wrong baby. I had spent 48 years lying to my own daughter about her identity while knowing exactly who her real parents were. But there was an even more devastating truth I was about to reveal, a truth that would explain why I had finally stopped switching babies and retired early from nursing. In 1990, I made a switch that went horribly wrong and forced me to confront the true consequences of my actions. Amanda Foster was born to teenage parents who were clearly unprepared for the responsibilities of parenthood. During labor, I overheard them discussing their plans to party that weekend and complaining about how a baby would interfere with their social lives. They seemed more interested in taking selfies with their newborn than actually caring for her. That same night, David and Helen Rodriguez gave birth to their first child after years of fertility treatments and preparation. They had attended every parenting class, baby-proofed their home months in advance, and were so excited about becoming parents that they cried with joy when they held their daughter. I switched the babies, convinced that Amanda Foster's child would be better off with the Rodriguez family, while the Rodriguez baby would somehow motivate the foster parents to grow up and take responsibility. 6 months later, I learned that the baby I had placed with the foster family, the Rodriguez's biological daughter, had died from sudden infant death syndrome. The foster parents, who were indeed immature and neglectful, had failed to follow safe sleep guidelines and had left the baby unattended for hours while they went out drinking. The Rodriguez's biological daughter was dead because of my decision to place her with an irresponsible family. Meanwhile, Amanda Foster's biological daughter was thriving with the Rodriguez family, who loved her desperately and gave her every advantage in life. But that knowledge couldn't erase the fact that my switch had directly led to the death of an innocent child. The foster parents, devastated by the loss but not knowing the baby wasn't biologically theirs, spiraled into drug addiction and eventually divorced. The Rodriguez family, grieving what they thought was their biological daughter, struggled with depression and guilt for years. That was the day I realized I wasn't playing God in a good way. I was playing Russian roulette with people's lives, and innocent children were dying because of my arrogance. But there was an even more devastating truth I was about to reveal. As my vision started getting blurry and I could feel my life slipping away, I knew I had to tell Carol everything before I died. "Carol," I whispered, gripping her hand tighter, "you need to know that you're one of the switched babies. You're not biologically mine." The look of confusion and horror on her face was unbearable, but I had to continue. "Your biological mother was Catherine Williams. She was 19 when you were born, and she thought she was giving you up for adoption. She never knew I switched you with another baby. She spent 48 years thinking her daughter was somewhere in the adoption system." Carol's face went completely white. "What are you saying? Are you telling me my real mother is alive?" "Yes. Catherine Williams lives in Salem, Massachusetts. She's a teacher now, married with 2 other children. She never stopped looking for the daughter she thought she gave up." The devastation on Carol's face was nothing compared to what came next. "There's more," I said, fighting to stay conscious long enough to finish the confession. "Your biological father, his name was James Mitchell. He was a college student when Catherine got pregnant. He never knew about you." "Where is he?" Carol asked, tears streaming down her face. "He lives in Burlington, Vermont. He's a social worker now, helps kids in foster care. He never knew he had a daughter." But I wasn't finished destroying her world. "Carol, I need you to understand that you're not the only one whose life I destroyed. There are 46 other people out there who don't know who their real families are. Some of them have spent decades searching for biological relatives they'll never find because those relatives are looking for different children." The magnitude of what I was confessing started to sink in for both of us. I hadn't just switched a few babies. I had systematically dismantled the biological connections of 47 families, creating a web of false identities that had affected hundreds of people across multiple generations. "Some of those switched children have children of their own now," I continued, "which means there are grandchildren who don't know their real grandparents, cousins who've never met, entire family trees that are completely wrong." Carol was sobbing now, but I had to finish the confession before I died. "I kept records," I whispered. "In the safe behind the painting in my bedroom. There's a list of all 47 switches, with the real names and the families who took the children, the dates, the hospital records, everything." "Why?" Carol asked through her tears. "Why did you do this?" "Because I was angry," I admitted. "I was angry that other people got to have babies when I couldn't. I was angry that some families had multiple children they didn't seem to want, while others desperately wanted just one. I thought I was fixing things, making them fair." "But you destroyed people's lives," Carol said. "I know. I destroyed 47 families, including my own. I spent 48 years loving you as my daughter, knowing you belonged to someone else." The paramedics burst through the front door at that moment, but I could feel myself slipping away. With my last breath, I whispered to Carol, "The list in the safe. You have to contact all the families. They deserve to know the truth." Margaret O'Sullivan died at 4:23 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, leaving behind the most devastating family secret in medical history. When Carol opened the safe in her mother's bedroom, she found detailed records of 47 baby switches spanning 30 years. Each entry included the real parents' names, the families who received the switched babies, birth dates, and even follow-up notes about how the children were doing as they grew up. Carol's first call was to Catherine Williams, the woman who was biologically her mother. "Catherine, my name is Carol O'Sullivan. I know this is going to sound impossible, but I think you're my biological mother." The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours and changed both their lives forever. Catherine had indeed spent 48 years searching for the daughter she thought she'd given up for adoption, registering with every database, hiring private investigators, never giving up hope that someday they would be reunited. "I always felt like a piece of my heart was missing," Catherine told Carol during their first meeting a week later. "I had 2 other children, but I never stopped thinking about my first daughter." The reunion was emotional and beautiful, but it was also complicated by the fact that Carol had spent 48 years loving Margaret O'Sullivan as her mother, despite learning about her crimes. Over the next year, Carol systematically contacted all 47 families affected by her mother's switches. Some reunions were joyful. People who had spent decades searching for biological relatives finally found each other. Other revelations were devastating. Families discovering that the children they'd raised weren't biologically theirs, or learning that their biological children had grown up with different families. The story became national news when Carol decided to go public, hoping to help other switched families find each other. The investigation revealed that Margaret's switches had affected hundreds of people across multiple generations. DNA testing confirmed that several people who had felt like outsiders in their families their entire lives were indeed not biologically related to the families who raised them. Others discovered they had biological siblings they'd never known existed. The legal implications were staggering. Inheritance rights, medical histories, custody issues. Margaret's switches had created legal nightmares that took years to sort out. But the most profound impact was emotional. 47 people had to reconcile their sense of identity with the revelation that their entire family history was a lie. Some of the switched children chose to build relationships with their biological families while maintaining bonds with the families who raised them. Others felt too hurt and confused to pursue those connections. A few biological parents who had thought their children were raised by other families discovered their children had actually grown up just miles away in families they passed on the street. Carol herself struggled with the revelation that Margaret O'Sullivan, the woman who had raised her with love and devotion, was also the person who had stolen her from her biological family. The complexity of loving someone who had committed such devastating crimes against so many people, including herself, required years of therapy to process. 5 years after Margaret's confession, Carol received a letter from James Mitchell, her biological father, who had moved from Vermont to Boston to be closer to the daughter he'd never known he had. "Carol," he wrote, "I can't get back the 48 years I missed of your life, but I want you to know that learning about you has been the greatest gift I could have imagined. Your mother, Catherine, and I may not have stayed together, but we both love you, and we're both so proud of the woman you became." The Margaret O'Sullivan case led to major reforms in hospital procedures for identifying newborns and tracking their movements within medical facilities. DNA testing became standard practice for confirming family relationships, and psychological screening for medical personnel was enhanced to identify potentially unstable individuals. But for the 47 families affected, no amount of policy change could undo the decades of living with false identities. Carol O'Sullivan, now using both her raised name and her biological name, Catherine Williams O'Sullivan, became an advocate for adoptee rights and genetic identity issues. She speaks publicly about the importance of truth in family relationships and the devastating impact of well-intentioned lies. "My mother, Margaret, loved me deeply, and I loved her," Carol says in her speeches. But love built on lies, even well-intentioned lies, creates a foundation that can't support the weight of truth when it finally comes out. The 47 families affected by her switches all had to rebuild their understanding of identity, family, and love. Some relationships survived and even grew stronger. Others couldn't withstand the revelation. But all of us learned that biological connection is just one form of family bond, and that chosen family can be just as real and meaningful as genetic family. Share this story if it moved you, because truth in family relationships is sacred, and the consequences of playing God with people's identities can echo through generations. Truth and healing win, always.